Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Gila County Master Gardeners and Payson Community Gardens webinar on planning your garden. We're going to be talking about intensive gardening techniques. My name is Chris Jones. I am your host and presenter today. So if I get a little nervous, it's just me sitting here. So I really appreciate having you all with me today. And go over this, what I think will be pretty useful for people who are in Payson and all gardeners. So a little bit about what we're doing here. This is part of my Garden and Country Extension webinar series. It is a weekly Zoom webinar. I make them 60 minutes or less. They're Thursdays at 11 in Arizona. Next month, it's going to be a little change of daylight savings. Doesn't matter to us in Arizona, but our partners from other states who might join us will have to adjust. So at this time, starting earlier in this month on February 11th through April, I'm hosting the spring gardening classes for the Payson Community Garden in Northern Gila County, Arizona. And if you've never been to the Payson Community Gardens, you should go. They'll get started sometime next month in May. Right now, the gardens are just bare. They had snow last month. They're getting things started. But if you're able to come up there in the summer, they tend to be at the garden on Saturday mornings. They'll have the gates open. They welcome guests, just see what they're doing, get some ideas. People are super friendly, always willing to share what they're up to, and just a great place to learn how to garden and how to be a community garden. When you are all in the same plot area sharing that space, if you get a bug or a disease or a weed, your neighbor gets a bug or disease or a weed. And so they have to get along with each other, and it's all just a great thing that we're able to see in Payson. A little bit about these, and also to find it. If you go up Highway 87 from the valley, you're going to go north of town. You're going to go past the first roundabout, and at the second roundabout, rather than taking a left to the Home Depot, you're just going to continue to the right, and you'll go past the Nazarene Church there, and you'll see it right there on your left, big parking area, and you can't miss it. Recordings for this will be at the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension YouTube channel. At the, here it is, you can just kind of Google that in. You'll find both the Payson Community Garden and the Garden and Country Extension webinar playlists where I've been putting this. I ran into a little difficulty last week. I stepped on my power button in the middle of the presentation. I know it only happens to me. And when that happened, I split the recording in two. So we're working on how to splice that together and see if we need to re-record the first half. But we'll get Susan Miller's presentation from last week up where we talked about how to get your garden started. And also want to make sure that people are aware the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Here is our agenda today. Thank you for everybody who joined me a little early here. That's our login and lag time. I am Chris Jones, your moderator, giving you the welcome. Today's topic is about planning your garden, and it's about intensive gardening. And Chris Jones, here I am, your presenter as well. When I finish that up, we'll go through our question and answer discussion with me. Many of you know that drill. Just look into the Q&A or the chat box, put your questions in there. I'll attend to those, answer them as best I can. I may even bring in some colleagues and people from the garden who may be able to answer those questions better than I can. Got so much support and other gardeners in this area on these calls that we can share this information. And we will get done by noon so we can get off to lunch here. And so here I am, Chris Jones, the extension agent for the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension in Gila County. And we are doing the Payson Community Garden Spring Gardening Series. Payson Community Garden, where the community gardens. As you can see, all those pine trees in the background, beautiful place to go visit and be part of. This is my opening slide for the presentation. If you want to get in touch with me, here's my contact information. I'm Chris Jones. You can reach me at 402-8586. If you call me right now, I'm not going to answer the phone because I'm talking to you. So the phone did just ring. And there's my email, ckjones@cals.arizona.edu. And we're part of our College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at the University of Arizona. So the ideas of intensive gardening. And so when you look into it, the idea of intensive gardening is how you're going to maximize the use of that space. You know, you've got so much area that you're going to garden, particularly as home gardeners or community gardeners, as opposed to being a farmer with acres. And even farmers, they want to maximize their use of space and yield. So that's one of the main goals of intensive gardening. You also want to have a high yield per unit space. So you've got your raised garden, you want to be able to continuously being able to bring your vegetables off, your crops off of there. And so it's having yield throughout the year, throughout the season, as opposed to, you know, you're going to be growing whatever you want for canning. That's another good thing too. But this here, just kind of a high yield per unit space and a continuous yield. And when I was looking into the literature about intensive gardening, they said one of the benefits is reduced labor. Well, I find gardening to be a lot of work. And so I'm not too sure that it is a reduced labor. You've got to get out there, you've got to work it. And if you don't love it, well, then we're going to the grocery store. All right, so one important thing for using, for intensive gardening is to use a raised bed. And the good thing about a raised bed is that it defines that space you're going to use for your garden. You know, you are going to concentrate your soil preparation in that space rather than, you know, if you're just in the ground and you've got some spaces on the edges for weeds or whatever, but that's one really good benefit of using a raised bed. You're only going to be gardening in that space that you've created for gardening, which makes a heck of a lot of sense here in Arizona, where we've got our desert soils, it's dry, you have to do so much work to make sure your soils are good. Some of the concerns and benefits about raised beds is that they will be quick to warm up. And in some of our cooler places, and here in the spring and, you know, coming out of winter here, that's a good thing. Warm up those soils, get the plants growing. The other thing is that they will be quick to dry out. It's up above the soil ground. It's easy for the water to drain out, and that additional heat that's on the side of the raised garden space can help them dry out. So you need to pay attention to your watering. You need to have an optimal soil mix of a loamy type of soil and organic matter that you're able to hold as much moisture in there as you can. And I'm going to go ahead and go through these slides as I'm speaking here. If you've got some questions about this area right now, just go ahead and throw them into the chat box or the Q&A. And I'm not going to be able to attend to them at this moment, but I'll jump to them as soon as we get done. That way you've got this in your mind and we're ready to answer it. Another really important idea of a raised bed and intensive gardening is to take advantage of the vertical space that you have. You've got the space that's close to the ground, but you also have whatever space reaches up into the air. And so ways that you're able to get certain species to come up off the ground are using trellises, using a cage, using a pole, you know, and looking for those species that are particularly suitable for that vertical gardening. And they're largely going to be plants that are considered indeterminate. They will be vining, and they'll be able to grow on a vine, and then you can train that up the up your cage or your trellis. And so I've got listed some good examples here. Many indeterminate species of tomato, so look for that. There are also determinate bush tomatoes that'll just kind of stay in one size, all harvest at one time, and others that'll harvest throughout the year. Peas, of course, grow very well on are vining. Some species of squash can grow up that way. Beans, of course, will lend well to vertical gardening. Cucumbers, so cantaloupe, if you come up with a way to hold it so it doesn't fall off. Just a lot of different species. And so taking advantage of vertical gardening is good. And anybody who's had some good experience with vertical gardening, go ahead and put what species you're doing that with in the chat box, and we'll just come to that and share that information. Now, some of the concerns and benefits of having a vertical garden is that it'll create a dry environment. And so when those leaves are picked up off the ground, rather than they being on the ground, kind of holding moisture into the ground, they will be up in the air. So two things go on with that. One important thing is they're going to, they're going to respire. They're going to allow a lot of moisture and so on to go back and forth. So you have to make sure you keep it irrigated properly. The other thing is that's not a good place for many diseases to be able to live. So having them up off the ground, taking care of some of the older leaves that may be on the ground just helps to keep it dry, really helps to take care of a lot of the disease problems. It also makes any types of insects that come in there easier to see. So those are some really good benefits of vertical gardening. The other thing that's going to happen with a vertical garden is you're going to create shade. And all of these plants that we like to grow, they like a lot of sunshine. Now, being in Arizona, we get a lot of sunshine. We can get too much sunshine. So taking advantage of how your vertical garden, your trellis may be creating shade, take advantage of that. It can create some coolness, take that afternoon sunshine off of some plants that you can have on that eastern side of your trellis. And that's just an example of something you'd be able to do. And then others, just if they need that sunshine, make sure you've got the shade, got them in a place that they aren't going to get shaded out. Another thing about using an intensive gardening space is that you can plant a little bit closer than you would typically in a garden. The recommended space, so when we're talking about spacing, let me go ahead and just stop this slide for, whoops. Let's bring myself up here for a second. I'm going to show you a few, come on guys, seed packets, and you guys see these. Boy, that doesn't work too well. I'll just have to hold it back here a little bit so you can't really see them. But when you flip over a seed packet, it's going to have a lot of information about what you're going to do with it. And so I'll have to put on my glasses to be able to read it. This also gives me a chance to see how I'm doing on time. Okay, so this is a Better Boy hybrid for a tomato. The nice thing about these hybrids, they tend to be disease resistant. Matter of fact, it says multiple disease resistance tolerance for verticillum and other types of disease problems. They take 7 to 10 days to germinate. They take 70 to 75 days to harvest. The planting depth is 1/4 inch. The row space is 3 feet by 2 feet. So huge row space. Really need a lot of space to grow. These are particularly good for canning. They're more of a determinate one that they're all going to come together at one time. Another one I've got here is a Swiss chard. And when I read this about the Swiss chard, it's going to have the same germination rate at 7 to 10 days. Its harvest days to harvest is 60 days, so it has a shorter harvest turnaround. Same planting depth at 1/4 of an inch. The row space is 20 inches by 6 inches. And this is recommended for freezing and canning. You know, of course, we like to eat it when it's fresh. Or some people don't care for chard at all, but you know. So let me get back to that. I was just reading those so we have an idea there of what we're talking about. Here's my slides. Hide that. Okay, so again, it's going to be from the center of that stalk, you know, kind of the crown of where it grows out of. And the recommended space for 2 crops is to take those planting spaces and sum them together, add them together, and then divide them. And that, so you can put them a little bit closer. So for example, something that doesn't take a whole lot of space, radishes you can plant, they recommend about 2 inches apart. A certain bean only about 4 inches apart. So add those 2 together, 2 plus 4 equals 6, divide it by 2, and the recommended planting space is 3 inches. So you can get them a little bit closer. And the other good thing, I just gave an example of that chard and that tomato, is the chard is a cool season plant. You can get it in early, it can get started. You can put those tomato plants in between, and by the time that tomato plant starts to get to where it's ready to start producing and it's a mature plant, you've already harvested that Swiss chard. So those are some really good ideas for intensive gardening and using that same space. And so that example is something we call succession planting. And particularly in the Payson area, and I think we run into some issues in the in Phoenix area because it's just the summers are so warm. But you can try to garden as much of the year as possible. So spring garden, a summer garden, and a fall garden is what they do at the Payson Community Garden. You know, too cold in the winter, they need to clean up and do a bunch of things. And so you'll be replacing a spent plant as you go. So like I say, that Swiss chard comes to harvest, you pull it out, you put something else in that space. Another concept of succession planting is something called relay. And relay is where you'll take, say, something like a lettuce, and you plant them at different time intervals. So put in a row of the lettuce or spinach that you want, and then 2 weeks later, plant it again. 2 weeks later, and another row right next to it. You know, one row there, another row planted a little time later, another row planted later. And this way you're always getting a continuous crop. And when it's something like lettuce that we like to eat fresh and year round, that works great. That relay technique is very nice for container gardens as well. If you've got several buckets that you can do this in, plant your lettuce in one, wait a couple weeks, plant your lettuce in another, wait a couple weeks, plant your lettuce in another one. And then you have this continuous harvest that when you harvest one, the other one's ready the next week and the other one's ready the next week. Another thing to keep in mind about succession gardening is those days to maturity. That tomato plant at 75 days, that chard plant at 60 days. When they are mature, you may still see some fruit on it. You can say, I can still eat that. But if you want to be taking good advantage of what you can produce out of a small space, you're going to harvest. And you're going to get something else to replace, put in that space. So some concerns or benefits about using succession planting is that you will need to have a continuous composting and fertilization. Plants, particularly like the tomatoes, they use so much of the nutrients out of the soil that when you do open up a space, work on a little bit of your compost. Up in Payson area, they really love their alfalfa pellets. Just something that's going to add that put that nitrogen back into the soil that got expended from the plant that you pulled out. And so just keeping an eye on how those plants are doing, how green they are, give them a little more food, and particularly nitrogen is what we run short of in our Arizona soils. Now, here's another concept of succession planting, where this is something you would do from season to season or within the season when you're switching them out. One example here is you would plant your nightshades, which are tomatoes and eggplants and potatoes in that group that use a lot of the nutrients out of the soil. Follow it up with the cabbage family, which are your broccolis and cole crops that are a cool season type of plant and will use some different nutrients. They tolerate a little higher pH. They do quite well in the cooler season. Those will come out. Good to follow those up with a legume. And as many of us in Arizona understand about legumes, they are nitrogen fixers. So they're able to take advantage of a bacteria that they have a relationship with called rhizobium and take nitrogen that's in the air, get it into their roots and leaves, and helps to benefit them. And then when you work them back into the soil, that's also a nice green manure for your plants. And then squash or corn would be a good follow-up, and then back to your nightshades. One thing about corn, not a good example for a small garden space, not something that we should recommend for intensive gardening because it just takes up, you need to plant enough corn for it to wind pollinate. And so usually not a good source for that. Here's another extended version where they talk about having squash followed by potatoes, potatoes by corn, corn by cabbage, cabbage by peas. Excuse me, my camera's in the way here. Peas to tomatoes, tomatoes to beans, some root crops and squash. And certainly, you know, if corn isn't something we're going to grow in our garden because it's just too large for that area, not a good one to have in there. Just while I'm on that topic of what's successful in a intensive garden and what isn't, corn's not a good choice, and neither are ones that take up a whole lot of space. Watermelons and pumpkins, they just really just cover all your space. So if you're going to grow those, certainly if you can, grow them out of your garden and onto the sides. Not necessarily something that works well at the community garden, but people like to try everything. The next concept we're going to talk about concerning intensive gardening is something we call intercropping. And intercropping is where you're going to mix up your species for your optimal results. And one is using cool season plants or vegetables versus warm season vegetables. And so here we are, it's February. Most places, it's a good time to get your cool season plants started. So back we're talking about lettuces, radish, beets, the cole crops, broccoli, cauliflower, all the ones that you can put in that space. And as those start to come to season, you can replace those with the warm season plants. And particularly in around 3,000 to 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet in Arizona, we're able to come in at the end of the monsoon season in August and plant those cool season plants again, particularly that broccoli. And it will get to a nice size by the time it starts to cool down. And then you could have some nice crops with those cool season plants in the fall. I brought up days to harvest earlier. Again, when they're ready to harvest, according to the label, they're really not going to be producing at their optimum. So take them out, replace them. Pay attention to the root zones. A lot of us, we love our tomatoes. They take advantage of a large root zone. Others are kind of small and skinny. You've got garlic, onions, carrots, radish. They kind of take up a small space. And excuse me, the phone wants to ring today. Excuse me there. Other plants have different nutrient needs. Like we mentioned, the legumes that can help fix nitrogen, and peas are cool season ones that you can grow in the winter and cool months, and other summer beans and bush beans that grow well in the summer. They'll help fix them, but others, like I mentioned, just use some different types of nitrogen nutrients. So when we're talking about following nightshades by following with the cabbage crops, they could just kind of use nutrients differently. There's also the shade tolerance. Our summer plants that we like to grow, back with the tomatoes again, they like that full sun, but the cool season plants, that's too intense for them. So having that shade for them and knowing what type of shade tolerance they have allows you to take advantage of just that in small area. Another good thing about intercropping and using lots of different species in your garden is it tends to be a deterrent for pests. Pests love a monoculture. They're able to come in, they have their one food that they really like and really have some issues with it. But if you have many different plants growing in one space, and particularly if you've got some deterrent plants that we'll be speaking of later, certain flowers, certain herbs that many insects would not prefer, that kind of moves them out. And having many of these species out there can also just be a way to have good hiding space and opportunity for your beneficial insects. That'll be a presentation for later on in the year. A little more about intercropping, some ideas here. It's good to plant radishes with carrots. And the idea there is your radishes won't take long to harvest. You know, you tend to have radishes after a month, 6 weeks, even less, but carrots need some more time. And the carrots are going to grow a little deeper. So when you pull those radishes out, you just created all this space around the carrots so it can be successful. Try starting with your cool season greens, like the lettuces and the chard that we mentioned, and follow that up with a summer crop. And then you can take those spaces between those greens, get your squash and your tomatoes and peppers in there. It is said that onions and lettuce and carrots all grow well together. As you know, they're also good in a salad. And then using the legumes such as beans with your summer crop or peas with the cold crop for the cool season is another way that you're able to take advantage of the nitrogen fixing that those plants, the legumes and beans may be able to do, and help out the other crops that you know use a lot of nitrogen and nutrients out of the soil. And finally, using that summer vertical garden as a nurse crop for the fall garden. Having that vertical garden on that western side so it catches that afternoon sun, creates some good shade for those fall garden crops to get started. And as I'm learning at our elevations, you can be putting those in August and early September, allow them to get started while it's still warm, and then be able to have some good crops in the fall already started. My master gardener, Rich Johnson, he grows his broccoli and eats it for Thanksgiving. It's also wise to grow some herbs and flowers along with your garden. These herbs and flowers help to bring in beneficial insects. They create different types of scents and smells that may throw off some pests. And so some examples they talk about is the bee plant or cleome, the dill or parsley or cilantro. These are also good herbs to be growing, good to eat. I have good luck with my parsley as a perennial, but when these plants get up there and put up their flower, particularly the dill, they just have a shape that benefits or attracts the beneficial insects. Basil is another good plant to grow for throwing off your insects. I have better success with like purple basil or spicy basil. your classic sweet basil, it tends to be, for me, it's just a little bit more tender. And those other ones still have a lot of great flavor to them, and they tolerate the heat a little bit better for me, or just this amateur gardener. Mint also, as you know, if you get mint into your garden, it may be pretty invasive. So watch where you put it. It might be good in a pot. But my experience with mint in our dry climate here, you don't irrigate for a summer, mint really doesn't make a good chance of coming back. Marigolds are ideal. So the marigolds have that strong scent, really throws off a lot of insects. And of course, garlic and onions and chives are a good idea. Some more things I'd like to share with you. They will talk about a trap crop. If you're able, and these are particularly for catching aphids rather than having them get into your main crop. If you have some of these trap crops where you're able to attract those aphids, put them in one spot, then you can harvest those up and just toss them so that the aphids don't have a chance to find other parts of your garden. And there's always a lot of companion folklore, ideas of putting certain plants with others that you may have some success with. So they say that chives repel aphids. Chives are great to have. They're a good perennial. And when you can get those started in pots and put those nearby, let's see if that helps out, and always good with some sour cream. They say basil repels the hornworm. As we know, when the season comes, when the moth is out there laying the hornworms, just keep your eyes out and pull them off as you see them. They say mint repels the cabbage moth. They say tansies repel ants, and nasturtium helps to repel the squash bug. But in any case, those bugs can get to a high enough population that you got to fight with them. So just some ideas there. They may work, may not work. Going to come to last couple of slides here. This is something that I'll be able to put on the website. It is a plot diagram for the Payson Community Garden. This is the 6-foot by 25-foot plot. 4 inches equals 1 square. And having a garden, you know, a diagram like this so that you can write what you planted where is a really good idea. And as well as you can have several of these, write notes on it. And so I've done this with the gardeners in the past and had several of them come back and said they made good use of this. So take some time to write out your garden plot if yours is any different. Put what you're doing in there, and that way you're able to refer back to it. Once those little sticks you put in the ground with your species saying what they were and they fall over, you lose them, they get washed away. So this is a good way to say what you're doing also. And once upon a time, I went to a great seminar with Kim Kostenhal, who is up in the Snowflake area. I think she's the owner of Ashcola Gardens. And she gave this example as an intensive garden where if you'll look at these different groups, and again, I can get this on the website as well. She's got one group she calls Group A, plants that start small but need space at maturity. So think of the broccoli, think of the tomatoes, the peppers, your big plants that take up a lot of space. So these ones would be her Group A that take up a lot of space. Group B are those that are fast to harvest. So lettuce, spinach, radish, and she puts that Group B in here in close to the big ones are going to take up that space, because by the time those come to harvest, you can pull them out, and the ones that need a lot of space and maturities can still grow into that space. Others that she has are what she calls the tall and skinnies, the beets and onions and carrots. And you can get those talls and skinnies in there, and they're not going to take up a whole lot of space, and just help to divide that garden, as you can see what she does with this, taking good advantage of that space. Also, we discussed using the companion flowers such as marigolds or nasturtium and having those in there interspersed to help add some color and deterrence for your insects. And finally, group E are the herbs and annuals such as basil and cilantro that she'll have in different parts of the garden on the sides here and so on. Good to eat and another deterrent for insects. So just really like this example. You can modify it or try it as it is and see how it works and modifies according to what's best for you. I am going to put that chat link back into the webinar evaluation link back in the chat box. And at this time, we're going to start our question and answer period. And I just want to make sure that you know that next week will be Thursday, March 4th. We will have someone from the Payson Community Garden talk about how to water your garden. And this is an interesting thing at the Payson Community Garden because they do provide the water. They have a watering schedule. They want to be as efficient as possible. So I think this will be a very interesting opportunity for people, even if you aren't at the Payson Community Garden, to see how they're successful using the minimal amount of water they need to and the topics there. So please join us next week for that. With that, I am back, and so are so many of you. Thank you so much. I don't know if I lost all your chat questions. I probably, yeah. So if you wrote in any chat questions for me before my computer connection, internet went down, put those in there if you can recall what they were. And let me get that link up again here. Okay, so here's the evaluation link. And you can let me know that was really bad how the computer died, but you're just nice people and you stayed with me anyway. All right, on to our question and answers. Here we had people help me out here. Okay, so Catherine's asking about days to maturity. Is it from the day you plant the seed or from the day the seed germinates? Gosh, that's a good question. I'm going to say from the day the seed germinates. And you know, it's always a general guideline. We try to get a lot of our winter garden plants started early. They'll germinate and they'll come up, but they'll sit until it starts to warm up a little bit. So it's under kind of an ideal growing period, and just paying attention to that, how it's growing if you lost a little bit of time on it. So good question. Which direction do you plant the crops? Like east to west for row of tall with shorter in front? And I think, Vicki, you've got it right there. This orientation at the Payson Community Garden, as you can see behind me, they have got these planted going north to south. And so the sun's gonna come up over here, if you can follow my prompter, and it's gonna come over and plant and end up over here. So they've got their sun setting on that side. And so like, yeah, so the benefit of that, I can bring up one of the gardeners here, or if you can type it in here for me, why we've got the crops, these primarily set up east to west, that'd be helpful. Eva asks, would love to hear comments about doing starts versus from seed for the crops discussion. Most of the species that you grow, you'll want to start them with starts. We had Rich Johnson on earlier with how he does his, starts his seedlings inside with his grow lights. And just that advantage of already having that plant grown to a small size and planting it out is really good. Now, some examples that are really good to put straight in the ground are ones that don't transplant well and also just love that heat. So for example, squash, you can get your squash started earlier, but squash does very well putting it directly in the ground and it comes up. I've also found that things like those herbs, cilantro, it grows well from the seed. Many things you can put them straight into the ground. So it's just a matter of getting that leg up. So when we're talking about intensive gardening, we would be saying it's better to do starts as much as you can. But a lot of plants, the other thing with putting them directly into the ground, the lettuces, the chard, those are all good to put directly in the ground. And when the temperatures are warm. So when the temperatures are ideal, that's a fine time to put seeds directly into the ground. So when we're talking about the succession planting and the interval planting, that's another time you would be planting directly in the ground. Thank you, Eva. More questions here. Thank you, Cheryl, for saying excellent presentation despite the tech issues. Thank you for sticking with me. There's the forms.gel, which is the evaluation, and suggestions for trellis that are strong enough for tomatoes while bearing. I find a lot of those ones that you're able to get at the store work well. If some people have some other ideas on what they're using, I think the ones that are made out of plastic, depending on how heavy they are, there's a lot of those, just like you're saying, they just aren't very strong. So I prefer a metal for the trellis, but they should do okay. Next question here, Gar is asking me, how deep should a raised garden be for the crops we talked about today? I like to recommend a garden that's at least about a foot deep. You're going to be fine in the range of 8-10 inches at least. But when you're working with a raised garden, you want to be sure that those roots are able to go down and do their thing. And if you're just directly in the soil, as long as you're going to be able to get the drainage that you need. The nice thing about that is as you work that soil above the native soil, it's going to work itself into the native soil as well. And so it's going to get deeper and just be able to turn it over and work it. So I think like the 2x6s, put those together, that makes a plenty deep garden bed. Vicky comments that in Prescott Valley, to start a raised bed economically, do you remove the deco rock down to the landscape cloth, add another layer of cloth, and then what for the soil at a minimum depth, and what at least for the lasting borders? Now, I'm not in the Prescott Valley, but I'm thinking you've got a fair amount of clay in that area. You will definitely remove that deco rock out of the way. You can, if you've got problems with, say, Bermuda grass and things like that, I think the landscape cloth is good to have to try to hold it out. It'll work its way in there anyway. And just using that landscape cloth more so to hold the soil in place than for it being able to escape, down, because you want to have that drainage. And some of your plants, their roots may try to go down into the native soil as well. So that minimum depth, again, I'm thinking anywhere from 8 to 12 inches is good. And what for least expensive, long-lasting borders? Ooh, least expensive is tough. Um, we're just using lumber. If people got some other ideas on what they're using for the borders, let me know. But I find the 2x6s to be inexpensive. The Douglas fir, they don't last forever. Cedar is really nice. And people use all kinds of things. Another inexpensive thing would be cinder block. So use the cloth around that, but that should be good too. Oh, Cheryl couldn't see my pointer, so sorry about that. And Cindy's asking about the use of the alfalfa pellets. Do you recommend liquefying them first or just randomly distributing them? That's a good question. I'm thinking you could just get them out there and water them down. And I'll let some of my colleagues at the garden help me out with that. They don't need to be too thick. Just think that the alfalfa pellets are just going to be a really good source of nitrogen. And it's going to be, you're going to look for organic alfalfa pellets that you can use. If you wet them down, I would hold on to that liquid and see if you can use that as fertilizer as well. That'll have a lot of nitrogen in it. Izzy, if you were with us, you didn't miss anything with the lost connection. I started over so that I can tie that together because we'll be putting those two together for the recording. Gail shared that bamboo works great in our lower deserts when it's hot. So try some, and probably using bamboo for the trellis. Is that right, Gail? And the recording will be, so Izzy, I'm going to put those two recordings together. So I've got that first half recorded and we'll splice these two together. So that won't be a problem. Susan commented here in Payson, they use the regular tomato cages that are too flimsy for the tomatoes due to the wind, but they work well with peppers. And they randomly spread the garden, and with the alfalfa pellets, they spread them on the garden and turn them in and then water. So work them into the soil. Can you use your pointer again to show north and south and how the sun goes behind me in that garden? Yes, yes. If you can see my pointer here, this to my left would be west. This over here would be the east. And then the plots are here going north and south. So they're going to get that full sun coming over just on each side. So they're going to have a nice distribution in sun. I'm sure that's why they have it east and west. Because if you put it the other direction, the plants on this one side are going to be shading out the whole time. Let's see here. And Izzy wants to know, will alfalfa sprout from the pellets? I do not believe that's ever been the case up there, but please let us know. Gail says she uses string, I believe she uses string for her trellises, and the metal will burn stems and leaves, so a little too hot there. Vicky says she's used those metal plastic covered stakes to anchor the metal tomato cages in place. I think another thing I've seen used is that concrete reinforcement wire. And that comes in different thicknesses. It'd be kind of a square pattern that could be used as a trellis as well. That can be pretty sturdy. June Wesley comments that cattle panels from Tractor Supply, perfect for cages and trellis. So those cattle panels, I'm sure they, hopefully we can get a good price at Tractor Supply on there. And yes, they certainly will last a long time. Okay, so, all right, so I've got this backwards here. So this is not easy for me. All right, that pointing that direction is Hope you're laughing at me here. That direction over there is west. That's where the sun sets. So this direction over here is going to be east. So that's where the sun rises. And then if you follow the way, the direction that the planters are orientated, that's east and west. Oh, sorry, that's north and south. Okay, so let me look over here to the question and answer, see if we had any other things here. And Susan confirms that the north to south orientation works really well when planting to control our shade needs. And this is an issue at the garden where you've got all your neighbors, and if they grow something very tall, then that'll shade your garden. And so I think there are even some height limitations in what they do there. And Margaret comments that most at the community garden spread the pellets over the garden, water them, and then they fall easily apart and till them in or dig them in. So they incorporate those alfalfa pellets into the soil. That's popular at the garden there. All right, we'll be bringing this to a close here. Gardener Supply has a good tomato cage that is square and folds flat for storage. That's a nice thing, and these are strong. Vicki says she has a raised bed that's 9x4 going east to west, and we'll plant the tall on the north side. So let me bring up that closing slide. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We will be back next Thursday. We're going to be talking about how to garden, or how to water your garden, and the techniques and ways that they do that at the Payson Community Garden. So thank you everybody. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time around.